Welcome everyone to today's webinar on positioning your supply chain in uncertain times. A warm welcome to all of our attendees from various parts of the U.S., including New Jersey, Denver, Nevada, Texas, New York State, and Virginia. And we do want to do a shout out to our friends over at ISM Houston and hoping everybody is keeping safe. Please be sure to use the Q&A tab for any questions, and Jane will answer them throughout the presentation. It is my pleasure now to welcome our speaker, Jane Tierney, who founded Purple Link in 2015, recognizing there's a better way to obtain value and achieve results. After earning a degree in industrial engineering from the University of Missouri, Jane obtained her MBA from San Diego State. Passionate about Lean and Six Sigma, she holds a Green Belt certification from the University of Michigan and has earned her CPSM and CPSD. In addition to running her business, she is an adjunct professor teaching operations management and supply chain strategies at California State University, Northridge, and serves on the advisory board of the California State Long Beach Operations and Supply Chain Management Program. Please welcome Jane.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today. I know this is a crazy time, but it's good to be virtual. It's expanded my reach to people to be able to do things virtually, and I know this is lunchtime for many of you, so thank you for spending your lunch with me. One good thing about the pandemic is it's really allowed people to reach out and connect without those long plane flights that I've taken so many times. I've traveled all over to meet with suppliers around the world, and it's nice to not have to do that for a while. So today I want to talk about the architectures, the ways that we have developed to have supply chains in all corners of the world, and how we might reimagine those and even re-engineer those as we get into recovery and in a post-COVID-19 world. So I thought I'd share this sophisticated graph with this high quality resolution. I actually found this early on in the pandemic. You can see the last month there is April, but I think it's still applicable. It still applies to me anyway. You can see that things like coffee are still pretty high on people's lists, and you can see that sweatpants went from very low to very high. So many of you are still working from home. I still work out of my home office most of the time. And so but supply chain is more and more in the forefront. I know people who used to ask me, what do you do and what's a supply chain? Now are like, oh, I get that. I know what that is. It became really obvious when people were looking for toilet paper in the stores. And I said, oh, I can tell you about that. So people seem interested in supply chains. I think there's people who made themselves experts in supply chains in the last 6 months. But if you're interested in that, which is why you're here, then you're in the right place. I'm going to talk about supply chains today, and I'm going to talk about risks in the design and architecture and ways that you can manage that. So I'm going to ask 3 questions for you. If we had if I was able to take a poll, then I would do that. If you want to put some answers in the chat, I can take a look at those as we go along. The first question is your organization questioning their supply chain architecture? I see varying different opinions on this. Lots of companies are. They're saying, why are we here? Why do we have suppliers in these areas? But that's one question. The second one is your organization satisfied with the quality that you're getting from your suppliers across the board? And then the third question is, are you confident on where to start to make changes? So what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe put into the chat the yes answers that you have, and we'll number these 1, 2, 3. So you could put just if you have answered yes to the first and second question, then just put 1 and 2 in the chat room. And if you can do some of that, then I can take a quick poll over that. So as you're kind of putting in your answers, I'm going to tell you that a lot of people answer yes to the first question. But the second and the third question, I'm getting a lot more no answers to as well. So if you want to participate, you can put in the chat room. Thank you for those who are doing that. If your company is examining your supply chain, then it's a chance to not only look at the supply chain, but try to get some improvements in the supply chain. Don't worry if you don't know where to start, because that's why I'm here. I'm going to give you some ideas and some thoughts and some ways to proceed. So I'm seeing quite a few yeses, which is great. I see a mostly, and I see several no's, which I don't, is not surprising at all. So thanks to all of you who do that. I'm going to take a poll at this at the end and kind of summarize this for myself to add to my sophisticated research. So thank you for participating. So today we're going to talk about the relevance of, not tonight's topic, but today's. We're going to look at some facts and figures of today's supply chains. We're going to talk about a 5-step process for architecture assessment, give you some alternative sourcing options, and talk about some risks and benefits of changing sources and moving sources and new sources. And I've got prizes to give away. So you have to be present at the end, but I've got prizes at the end of this, and we'll keep it to an hour. So we have a lot to cover, but I want to stay connected to you. I like to do these in person, but that's not possible. So I'm very happy to do these virtually, but I want to stay connected to people. So what I'd like you to do right now is to send me an email to jane@purplelink.co. There's no M, just .co, with the subject line webinar. If you do that, you'll get into tonight's prize drawings. So you have to be here at the end, and you'll get some ongoing resources, including the slides from today's presentation. If you're not quite ready, that's okay. I'll give you another chance at the end before I make the drawing, but you can go ahead and start doing those anytime. Just put webinar into the subject title. So I'm going to give you a little background about myself, because I'm going to share some data with you, but I'm not really a researcher. I'm a practitioner. I've got a lot of experience driving cost and risk out of supply chains, and now I work with my clients to do that. I have a background as an industrial engineer, so I always say efficiency, productivity are really second nature to me. That's what I learned to do, and that's what I'm really good at doing, and I help companies do that. I'm process-oriented, and I value consistency. So I worked as an engineer, moved into management. When I got into the management, I needed an MBA to understand the financial side of things. So I needed more education than I got in engineering school. I went back and got an MBA. About the time I got my MBA, my company shut down completely. They just closed the plant. So I'm standing there with my brand new diploma and no job after several years of working for that company. So what I found out was that was really an opportunity. It was really a gift, because that helped my transition into supply chain. I always tell people I came into supply chain through the side door, because that's not what I started pursuing. I'm a bit of a factory geek. I like factories. I like plant tours. I've dragged my husband all over the world in plant tours. Every time we go somewhere, we like to travel. If they have plant tours, I'm like, let's go, let's go. I like the supplier interface. I like working with a lot of processes, manufacturing, non-manufacturing, a lot of different people. Sitting on the plane for hours and hours, because I've been able to see some amazing places, but really meet amazing, incredible people all over the world. I've worked for some very good companies, well-run companies like HP, Agilent. But I got tired of the corporate world, and I wanted to spend more time on strategic initiatives like supply chain design, supplier management, and adding value through different initiatives, and spend less time doing performance reviews and approving low-dollar POs. So I find that in my career, I was most successful when my values were aligned with the company I worked for and the people that I worked with. So when I set up my company, I said, I'm going to do the same thing. These are my values. These are the things that I find important. And I have goals to use my skills and experience to help my clients and really improve the bottom line, instilling continuous improvement attitudes throughout the organization. I started this business 5 years ago now, based on deriving more value from supply chains. So I work with professional organizations like ISM, but I also work with APICS and SIPS and CSCMP to stay current and to make sure that I cover all of the bases. I teach these college classes, as Kathy mentioned, because I like to give back. I like to prepare the students for the workplace, and really it helps me keep my own skills honed and sharp. So I expect you're here today because this is an important topic to you and your company. It is to many companies and many people in the supply chain industry today. This pandemic, COVID-19, has sent shockwaves throughout the global supply chains, and we saw that very early in for products. We know, I live in California, in Southern California, and we know that earthquakes here are often followed by aftershocks. And we had kind of an earthquake in the March timeframe from the pandemic, and we're still having aftershocks long after that. So as we move toward recovery, and I know you're in all different parts of the country, so some of you are farther along than others. Some of you are still dealing with a lot of the pandemic issues. Others of you have hopefully seen the worst of it behind you, but there's a lot we don't know. So as we move forward, organizations are looking at their supply chains more closely than ever before. They're looking to close gaps that the pandemic has exposed, and they're looking very much in detail to see what other risks could be there. This whole risk in the supply chain thing has taken on a new life of its own. So as part of recovery and second waves and whatever, we're trying to move into what we call the new normal. What that looks like, you still get varying perspectives of that and various projections of what that's going to be. But the focus has to be on continuity of supply, limiting disruptions, building in more flexibility and agility, being responsive to customers, and maintaining the cost and quality with an eye to keep these cost-saving going as long as possible. These things haven't changed. I'm willing to bet most, if not all of your companies were concerned about cost reductions in 2019. In 2020, first we had the pandemic and we had a lot of focus on assurance of supply. But once we get that supply back to where we have some consistency there and some confidence that we're going to be able to make what we need to make, deliver what we need to deliver to our customers, then we start back with can we manage the cost? Can we reduce the cost? Because sales are down, the whole economy has taken a bunch of swings one way and another, and we aren't through this yet. So we need to be looking at those things that are going to help us stay where we are, stay viable in the meantime, and then move into recovery and beyond. So this is going to take some serious strategic analysis, some planning. And a lot of organizations are feeling a lot of pressure to move very quickly, but we want to avoid the knee-jerk reactions. We want to look at how can we do this, analyze this correctly, thoroughly, and do it right so that we can execute and do it expeditiously and correctly. So there's a lot of things that have been affected. The travel, the logistics, all of these things are still up in the air. Some people are starting to travel. Some people are very reluctant to. Some people are avoiding that like the plague. So wherever you are, I'm sure there's other people in that same area, and just be aware that there's people all over the map with this pandemic. So here's what we've seen a lot so far. The consumer demand has reduced, it's increased, it's changed. Retail stores, a lot of the retail stores that we went to routinely are not open. Here in Southern California, most of our malls are still shut. So in fact, all of the big malls are shut. There's some smaller stores in the strip malls that are open, but there's a lot of retail stores that we've seen declare bankruptcy, are having a lot of problems, are closing a lot of stores. So there's a lot of issues there. There's some essential stores, but those have some limited hours. Their capacity has changed, the content there. There's been some aisles that were pretty low in different parts of the spring and the summer, and I expect to see that again in the fall. So the goods availability has been sporadic. The online shopping has been through the roof, and there's other kinds of companies that are really doing well with that. The Instacart, which no one heard of, now people are using that routinely. I know at one point Domino's was hiring huge numbers of people to be drivers because of their increased business. And yet we see other stores that are hurting, and a lot of unemployment numbers are huge. People are getting furloughed, so they're not really laid off, but they're not able to go to work right now. there's lines, delivery services are overwhelmed, and the PPE is one issue, and the cleaning materials are still in scant supply. I listened to someone from Clorox in the last couple of weeks who said it's probably going to be mid-2021 before things like the Clorox wipes and a lot of the other products that they make are back in fully stocked modes on the shelves. These products are coming back and they're somewhat available, but not like the routine availability that we saw in February and before that. So, and personal protective equipment, we learned that a lot of that is not made in the United States. It's made in varying parts of the world. And there's a big push to bring a lot of that back, which has a lot of validity to that. And then there's some challenges with those. And we see this kind of ebb and flow in the different parts of the country and you're seeing some shortages, you're seeing some issues with the PPE and then the cleaners and all of this kind of stuff. It's led to some different gray markets, some price gouging. We've heard different things. We've seen companies pivot and make things that they never made before. And we don't know how long they're going to make those, but it might become a staple of the company and it may be something that's very temporary. I was very impressed watching the car companies pivot to make things like ventilators. So there's a lot of changes, and I don't think we've seen all the changes yet. So there's a lot more coming, and then we have to take some time and examine that once we get a little distance. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. The way supply chains are today was not something that just happened in 1 week, 1 year, 1 month, whatever. There's a lot of make-buy exercises that were done to decide to outsource processes back in the early, as the 70s and the 80s, a lot of this started. So companies started doing make-buy decisions. There were economic downtimes like those in the late 80s. If you're not old enough to remember that, you can look in the history books and find that out. There was a Black Monday in the late 80s and then an S&L crisis. NAFTA was drafted in 1992, so people think that that's fairly new, but it's back to 92, and now that's been changed or in the process of being changed with a lot of those. The tech bubble has begun. It began in the 70s, 80s. It grew. It had a big burst in 2000, and then that was combined with 9/11. That slowed the GDP considerably at that time. We had good years of GDP growth until the end of 2008 when we had a big financial crisis, and I think most of you will remember that. There was a big Japanese earthquake in 2011 that affected a lot of parts, especially electronic parts all over the world. That tsunami that hit that did a lot of devastation and damage to Japan, but it really impacted a lot of the business that's done there. The sequestration in 2013 hit the government pretty hard, and a lot of companies who did government defense and government contracting, that was harmful to them. And then Iraq, Afghanistan, into the 2016's election, trade wars that because subsequent to that, the tariffs that have been implemented, making a lot of things that come out of China more expensive because of the tariffs and the duties that are applied. So we've had a lot of changes. When we first started outsourcing, we being American companies started outsourcing, a lot of that was because of high labor content. And the labor rates were so much less overseas, especially in Asia, that we outsourced a lot of parts there. So we outsourced parts and subassemblies. And then more holistic, more complete subassemblies and even OEM type things quickly followed. In the 90s, we had gurus like W. Edwards Deming and Jack Welch espousing Six Sigma. A lot of black belts got created. A lot of black belt training got done. Tools that improved productivity and efficiency, then helped put Toyota and Hondas, many of those, into your garages and driveways today that weren't there in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. we had this outsourcing craze almost, and companies like Apple decided they were not going to manufacture at all, that they are not manufacturing experts, don't want to be. So they partnered with Foxconn, and they put their energy and their dollars into partnering with Foxconn so that Foxconn produces all of the Apple products. Apple designs them, but the manufacturing is pretty much outsourced as a whole. So those products are made, Foxconn's a Taiwanese company. A lot of those have made, almost all of those are made in China. So companies began to outsource a lot in order to reduce cost, in order to reduce the cost of equipment, the space that they needed, and the headcount that they needed. And sometimes they increased headcount, but the headcount was so much cheaper in other areas that it made sense to do that. If you look at manufacturing industries like circuit board fabrication, those were really big targets. A lot of companies had done that internally, found that it was expensive to buy the material, the machinery and the materials, expensive to maintain that machinery, especially when you had to have clean room environments and things like that. So that was one of the first things and big things that were outsourced. Once the circuit boards got out, then it was easy to say, oh, that circuit board goes into this, and maybe we could buy that subassembly. The companies that were doing that, the Jables, the Selectrons, the Flextronics, many others, Benchmark, they started getting bigger and bigger. Some of those moved together, they merged, they've changed around, they've done different things. So they were done because these climate controlled areas weren't cheap. The equipment wasn't, the equipment kept changing and getting better. A lot of contract manufacturers emerged and grew because of that in Mexico, Asia, now Eastern Europe. There's some in South America. So they're moving all over the world. But a lot of that has a huge population, and the workforce was gaining the technical skills to apply to that. So Asia has a couple of real big draws for companies, American companies. One is the labor rates were cheap, but the other one is the population and the potential markets. So when you look at China and India together, their marketplace is so huge. It's almost 3 billion of the 7 billion people in the world, and it's very tempting for companies to go there in those two countries alone. That doesn't take in the rest of Asia, which is also very highly populated. So companies moved into Asia for manufacturing, but they also moved there for markets. And that hasn't changed, and that isn't changing. If anything, it's more attractive than ever. So supplies shortages exist today. They're going to persist. We're going to see some up and down on that, I think, until we really get a handle on the virus and figure out how to treat it better, how to vaccinate against it, how to contain it. We've seen the labor availability change both for white and blue collar. There's quarantines, there's guidance, there's preferences. So some companies have allowed, at first maybe they mandated work from home, and now as we migrate back to offices, some employees opt to not go back to the office. So they're working with their employers to try to set up ways that they can work from home, or at least work from home part-time or most of the time. Some people really prefer getting back to the office, and that's great. Some people never left their workplaces because they were considered essential and they had to keep going. Some people became ill themselves. Some people are caregiving to those that are ill. There's so many different scenarios going on. Spend Matters says that 50% of the Fortune 500 companies were affected, and I think it's more than that. I think it's probably really close to 100%. ISM at one point found 95% of businesses seeing supply chain impacts in one way, shape, or form. Beijing reported an increase in cases recently, and Hong Kong as well. These spikes that we've seen in June, July, 15 states really highly hit. Some of those now those numbers are coming down, and we're seeing other hotspots arise. So we're seeing states reopen in lots of ways, multiple phases, pluses and minuses, doing different things across a state. I live in California. We do a lot of things differently in different areas just because of the virus penetration in those areas. And unemployment, which is really a phenomena all by itself. It's causing a lot of workers to reevaluate their jobs. Is this what I like doing? Is this what I want to do? Am I happy in this company? How do I want to live my life the rest of my life? So it's an interesting time. So let's look at some of the things from China, because China seems to always bubble to the top of the discussions. At one point, all provinces in China had reported infections. All industrial centers have been affected by the virus. China seems to have lower numbers. They've seemed to contain it better, but we also see news bulletins about peaks and valleys and spikes in different areas. Travel bans within China have been put in place. Those come off and then they go back. There's a lot of quarantine restrictions. So there's a lot of things going on there, and that changes. It changes week to week. And it's hard to keep up with all of that. S&P at one time, they expected China's growth rate to fall from 19% to 5%. I've seen improvements to that lately, but we're not sure because China's growth rate is dependent on their markets as well. And with all of the exports, if those markets don't rise, even if China is back to being able to handle things, then their demand is going to be reduced. 81% of companies American companies rely on Chinese suppliers in some way, shape, or form. One of the interesting things that came out of this is I talked to several people who said, we don't really buy anything from China. And then the next time I talked to them, they said, you know what, we don't buy anything from China, but we found out our suppliers buy a lot of stuff from China. So there's the depth of the supply chains and the reaches into the webbing, the networking of the supply chains has really come into more focus, into more of awareness of people in the last few months. 1 of 3 companies says they have major Chinese customers. Again, the customers affect the supply chain as much as anything. 41% of companies have faced project delays, increased costs. Again, this number is a couple, probably a month or 6 weeks old. I think that's probably higher now. Companies are still worried about production stops and slowdowns because of getting product in and out. And then 91% of Chinese companies had resumed business by late April, but only 4% were at full capacity. So that's an older piece of data now, April, May kind of thing. But bringing these companies back up to full capacity, again, depends on the situation in China, but it also depends on the demand. And because China got the virus early, the demand from the rest of the world has kind of ebbed and flowed in the meantime, and it's kind of still all over the place. So let's look at what China actually exports. Here's some of the things the products that come from China. A lot have to do with electronic goods. Air conditioners, it's been really hot here in Southern California, and we're kind of spoiled. We don't get a lot of that. So the air conditioners themselves come from China, and a lot of the parts come from China. So that can be a problem. We're seeing hurricanes now. Marco and Laura are out there. We've seen some others earlier this season, and a lot of valves and pumps that are part of hurricane preparedness and hurricane recovery, those come from China. So countries, counties, cities, businesses may need those things, and they may or may not be available in the quantities that they'd like. We learned that almost 100% of the medical masks were produced overseas, along with gloves and other PPE. So that's changing where you get more visibility on that, but there's a lot of other products that we're not seeing all the detail on. But it's interesting because we are not the only country that China does business with. And if you look at Chinese trading partners, the USA is 17%, which is a big part of that. And we're the largest single entity. It's interesting to me, China considers Hong Kong a trading partner, even though Hong Kong has reverted back to being part of China. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, 4%, and the other parts of the world are 58%. So our 17% versus the 58% is not significant, except that we are the largest single trading partner. Now, China does business with with Europe, with Africa, with other parts of Asia that aren't listed here. So there's a lot of trade that's going on that doesn't involve the US. What I know for sure is there is a better way to design and redesign these supply chains. What we have today is the result of this evolutionary process. We built on decisions made in some cases 2 and 3 decades ago, almost 4 decades ago now, if we go back to 1980. But given the situation that we're in, it's really not simple and easy to just reshore everything or to bring all manufacturing back in-house. So I hear companies and people and politicians say, we should bring everything in-house or we should bring everything back to the US. That sounds great on the one hand, but when you look at it, the feasibility, the practicality of it comes into question. Because what would it cost to do that? How much time is it going to take to do that? Even if you had the facilities here in the United States, which no company has the ability and the capacity to bring everything back in very quickly, then it would take time to do that because you've got to keep that continuity of supply going. And I know all of you are ISM aware, so if you're not members, you're still in this profession and you recognize that moving things is not simple, easy, and it's not free. So if we're going to move things, we need a process and we need to look at some insight and prioritize these opportunities because it's not something that's done overnight. And once you make those decisions, it's like outsourcing it in the first place. That genie doesn't go back in the bottle. When you make these decisions, word will get out no matter how confidential you treat it, how proprietary you treat those decisions, they will get out. And there will be consequences from those decisions that you're going to need to deal with that are just from the politicization of that, the emotional issues attached to that. There's a lot of things that companies are going to have to deal with. So when you plan to make an architecture change, these events are really important and they're critical to company success. You've got to invest the time and the people in the projects that yield the greatest return and make sure that you think it through. So you want to be thinking about risk-based decision making. You want to make these decisions and the risk at every step. So I'm going to give you this 5-step process. One is, first, you've got to have assurance of supply. You really have to make sure that you've got product continuing. Sometimes that means increasing inventories so that you're making inventory at the current supplier and that at the new location, whether it's the same supplier or just a different location. So that assurance of supply has to be continued. And oftentimes there's a cost increase because you're buying more material, you're manufacturing in 2 different locations while you ramp one up and ramp the other one down. So that is your first consideration, because if you don't have the product moving, then you can't satisfy your customers and you're going to be in trouble. The second thing is to look at the sourcing strategies and make sure that you do the analysis and goal alignment. The third thing is really look at what are your options. And again, you don't start looking at options after you've made decisions. You make these options part of your decision making. You use risk-based decision making all along the way, and then find your new architecture. So let's take a look at these in just a little bit of detail. Again, if you can't keep your customers happy, your business is not going to survive. So you've got to keep shipping your products and delivering your services. You need a good old-fashioned S&OP practice. So sales and operations planning is very, very important. Look at the latest forecast information because forecasts change right now depending on demand a lot. So what you were forecasting back in January, February is probably not what you're forecasting now for a year-end number. And what you were forecasting in June may not be what you're forecasting for September. So look at that. That S&OP practice is very important. So it's kind of back to basics in that. Look at your backlog of orders, whether you use MRP or ERP systems or just have spreadsheets, you need to develop a plan. Look at your material availability and look at what you project that material availability to be. How much confidence do you have in your suppliers being able to continue to deliver the material that you need, whatever your forecast is? So you want to keep in good, close contact with your suppliers to continually confirm they can meet those requirements within your schedule. And then you can order those and put all those pieces together. If your suppliers can't meet your deadlines, you've got to adjust your plan, or you've got to adjust your sources. So you've got to figure out what you can do in those situations. Lead times are all over the place. ISM found supplier lead times have increased by over 200% in China and as much as 200% in the US. And this was based on about 550 primarily US-based companies. But when you have lead times double, that changes a lot of the things that you can do. So you want to make sure that you stay on top of that. And that requires continued and detailed conversations with your key suppliers. And then, of course, you have to look at the labor and ensure your labor resources are going to be. You probably need some overtime if you're going to try to ramp back up. You need to have the budget for that. Some companies have furloughed workers, so you've got to make sure that you've got a recall schedule for those workers to ensure that the workers are on site and available if and as needed. And you've got to make sure that you keep all of those channels with your customers and suppliers open so that you're working in harmony to do this. And that's just to make sure you've still got product coming through. Then you want to look at your current architecture. So you really want to do a map. You want to note not just the companies that you deal with as suppliers and customers, if you can do that. You want to look at the production sites of these suppliers. More than once, I've had someone on my team surprised when they say, well, I always placed my orders to this location, but I just found out they're producing those completely in a completely different location. So where you place your orders is not always where your manufacturing is being done. So make sure that you check with your suppliers and understand their production sites. You want to look at not only your tier 1 suppliers, but your tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers for the key parts and the key components that you need to keep things going. And you're going to need probably some input and feedback from your tier 1 suppliers to help identify some of those. You want to categorize these suppliers and these parts. Look at these. Are these custom or commercial parts? Do you have single and sole sources, or do you have multiple sources available that you just haven't tapped into? Are these parts really hard to replace? And are they special qualifications? I know in my manufacturing experience, we had parts that were readily available from 2 or 3 different suppliers, but we qualified one brand within our part, say it was a pump or a motor, and there may have been other motors or pumps available on the market that had met pretty much the same specifications, but they weren't qualified in the units that my company produced, and they may not fit or they may not perform exactly the same way. So you have to look at all of those kinds of details. You want to use a matrix to show your parts and your suppliers by location. So figure out where your parts are coming from. And it's another thing that I found people were surprised by was the content. So a friend of mine works for a machine manufacturer. They make machining centers, and they have windows in those machining centers that are high impact, but they're very clear, they're very good quality, and they're plastic. So they had ordered those, and they found out that that supplier had been diverted to start making things like face masks and PPE for the medical industry. And so all of a sudden, they had shortages where they never even considered that that was an issue, because it was a plastic part that they had been buying for years. But all of a sudden, they had a shortage. So you want to look at these things. Think about what other things might be impacting your supply chain. So look at current production development products. Again, look at the source of the goods. Look deeper into those. List your parts by supplier. Make your own list of what you think is easy to resource, sole source, single source, whatever, and what you want to remain that way, and what you might have an opportunity to change. So maybe you have a sole source or a single source. this might be a good time to reevaluate that and see if you want to multiple source it or if there is another possible source. You want to look at not only the needs that you have now for your assurance of supply, but medium range, which I think is about 6 to 9 months out, and then eventually long range as well, which is 1 to 2 to 3 years out. Because if you make a change now, again, you're not going to be able to make that. Typically, you can't make that within a couple of months. It takes 3 to 6 months to make some of these changes in your architecture. And so if you're not thinking past today and what you need in the next 6 months, then you might find yourself in another problem in 6 months. So you have to take a step back, take an honest look at your current known challenges with the suppliers that you have. Where do you have delivery problems? Where do you have quality problems? Where do you have relationship problems? And where do you have a lot of risk that maybe you haven't dug into and really identified the details of that? So look for potential impacts given a global economy. Look for specific health situations by country, because we're seeing countries that were doing pretty well now having relapses or having additional spikes, and the tariffs that we know about today and what's possible going forward. Because as we know, this is not only a pandemic year, but it's an election year. And a lot can happen in the next 3 months until the election, and then past that, I think there's a lot of open questions. So look down, narrow down, identify your biggest risks and your biggest potential for benefits. So you want to generate options. The best way to get a good solution is to generate a lot of ideas. So you want to think about what you might be able to do. Look at the availability of alternative sources. One thing you can do is find out if your suppliers have multiple locations. If they do, they might be able to help you. And if you can get your suppliers to help you bear some of this risk and the cost of moving from place to place, that's a big deal. So if your supplier has locations not only in China, but in other parts of Asia, maybe Eastern Europe, maybe South America, Mexico, then you might be able to have them help relocate part of your production to another area to reduce your risk. So you really got to increase the depth of your understanding about the parts that you're buying now. Then you have to look at your volumes. I've worked in defense and aerospace, and sometimes our volumes were so small that it didn't make sense to have multiple suppliers. It didn't make sense to resource. It didn't make sense to do a lot of things. So you want to understand what are your volumes and does that support that? And again, you're looking at your volumes today. You're looking at the volumes that you have in 6 months and then 1 to 3 years out. Do you have contracts in place? So if you have hard contracts and long-term agreements, what are those? What are the penalties? What are the costs, if any, to change those things? And do you have reciprocity agreements? So not illegal reciprocity, but do you have countries who say, if you don't produce in this country, then you're not allowed to sell into this country? So those are reciprocity agreements. And if you take your products out of that country and find out that you've cut off yourself from markets, that's going to be a problem. So you want to look at those kinds of things. You have to protect your assurance of supply, and you can do that by ramping a second supplier while the first supplier provides parts. You can do that clandestinely, or you can do that out in the open. If the current supplier has another location, you can do that. You can build that up. And if you have inventory built up prior to moving from one to a supplier to another, that can help bridge that gap. That can help you get from point A to point B. But that requires building up your inventory. And most times the finance people look negatively on that. You might have inventory built up because your demand was decreased by the pandemic. So that might help you out. But you really have to look at that. You need to do some cost modeling. And again, you need to look at, where do I want to be? What are my targeted locations? And why do I want to be there? And what's the possible risk of moving from point A to point B over the course of the next, again, short term, 3 to 6 months, and then long term, 3 years? What's the possibility of things changing? So if you have things in Eastern Europe, if you're looking at some of those some of the political structures over there. There's some volatility there. Same thing in South America. They've got a lot of changes, and some of the South American countries that looked pretty good to do business in before have been hit pretty hard by the pandemic. So you want to check all those things out. Then you want to look at how you're going to make these decisions. You really want to look at risk-based decision making. You want to structure your understanding and the balance of risk and reward. So cross-functional teams are a must. You've got to have the different perspectives. You've got to look at different kinds of solutions and maybe some hybrid solutions that you hadn't considered before. You've got to figure out what is your company's appetite for risk, what are your customers' appetite for risk, and what are your suppliers' appetite for risk. So that's a concept that I can do a whole nother presentation on, is looking at the appetite for risk and the risk-based decision making. So think about how that works with your organization. You can use these 4 T's, which says terminate because it's not worth the risk. I think I can manage the risk, so you're going to treat that risk and you're going to move forward. Is it something you can tolerate? There's risk there, but we don't think the impact is going to be too much, or the probability isn't very high, so we can tolerate that. And then can we transfer that risk, which means can we get others to help us with that, either customers, suppliers, other organizations, other departments in your organization, any way that you can help share that risk. So consider your stakeholder values, the risk appetite of everybody involved, and again, cost benefit analysis. So formalize your structure, get your budget, get your schedule, get your resources, figure out how you're going to move and change your architecture, get your stakeholder support, get your supplier support. I always advocate transparency. If you're going to move parts out of a supplier, let them know that. You don't need to be punitive about it. You don't need to be, but if you have a bad relationship, you need to figure out how to treat that, because you don't want to lose the supplier support for your assurance of supply until you have the second supplier up and running. So communicate, communicate, communicate. That's always important. And get your suppliers to help you, because many times they will help and maybe you can offset some work with other types of work. Then look at your potential benefits and your potential impacts. So the impacts, the challenges, high labor content could cost you more when you move it from a low-cost country to another area. You may get an increase, even if it's a small increase. You may get your labor content may drive your prices up. Quality. Every time you move a product, then you've got a learning curve to come up, and you probably have some quality issues trying to get back up to that productive state. You might have a long qualification time, and with COVID and pandemic and shipping and all of those things may take longer, may be harder for people to qualify if they're not coming into the office on a regular basis. Your supply base may grow in the meantime, and that may cause some issues. And then your unit prices can increase, but I've seen unit prices increase, but the total cost gets lowered, and that's a good thing for a company. Maybe not the way you're counting your metrics, so you have to look at that, because I've seen companies not make decisions or make decisions not to change something because the unit price increased, even though it was obvious that the total cost was going to decrease because you changed the packaging requirements, you changed the shipping, you changed the lead time, you changed the inventory amounts that you needed, but they didn't make that because they got a slight increase in a price. So knee-jerk decisions aren't going to get you there. You really need to look at, again, longer term. And then the benefits, potential benefits are huge. You can get out of geographic areas you don't want to be in or you feel are risky. You really get an increased awareness of everything. You reduce your freight, you can reduce your inventory balances, and you can get better quality at this. So monitor your information because it changes daily. Start with the first 2 steps and launch your project. So these are just the basics. And I realize that this is a lot. It's not easy to implement. It's not easy to communicate this. And it's not easy to bring all of this into your organization. So when I'm in person, I ask for thoughts on what I've just shared, but it's harder to do that. What I'm going to ask you to do is to put into the chat or just write down for yourself one or more things that you can take away from this presentation and take back to your organization. If you're like me, you go to these talks and you get inspired, or your interest gets piqued and you get some ideas. But then you go back to the office, and you're going to do that here in a few minutes. And if you're not, and you forget, you get distracted by what happened in the last hour that you were out listening to this webinar, or you find out there's another disruption or something else. And you try to explain some of this to people, others in your office, and they don't fully get it because they weren't here and they haven't had time to absorb this. And maybe you haven't had time to fully absorb all of the information I just gave you, because I just gave you quite a data dump. So all of this I know can be really, really frustrating. So some of you have great companies that you work for, and I saw a lot of yeses on those questions, which means you have what you need, and that's great. But some of you don't. If you don't have great in-house resources to address these and a lot of other problems that might be arising, if your organization isn't really equipped for these and other activities, but you recognize the need to implement some of these or all of these techniques and processes into your own workplace, then I invite you to consider working with me. If you're impatient to get started, then we should talk. You can schedule a time with me to explore working together further. This call is complimentary. I reserved a limited number of slots and making these available for people who need more assistance to implement one or more of these concepts, to get the results they need, and to talk about how they can move forward. And we want results, I know, by the end of the year, and that's coming more fast. There's faster than I could ever imagine possible. So if you do make this call, I'll walk you through a process to talk about your biggest savings opportunities, and we'll decide collaboratively how we can work together to help you maximize on these opportunities and reduce your cost and risk. I take this time to work with you personally because every company is different, every situation is different, and because working together requires a mutual investment, building some trust, and I want myself and my clients to be confident that Purple Link is the right fit for their organization. It's simple to get this free call. You just go to callwithjane.com, and it often helps to put the HTTP in front, depending on your browser. You can pick a time zone. It takes you to my calendar. You pick a time zone, select a meeting time, and you're all set. So this is a really great option for you if you're not sure of the first steps to redesign your architecture and stop dollars that are leaking through your supply chain. So some of you are thinking, oh, that sounds good. I'll do that later. So I'm going to give you an incentive to do it now, before you get back to the piles of work on your desk and the crisis of the day overtakes you once again, before you forget or get engrossed in lots of other things on your to-do list, and before you lose my contact information. So if you have questions about this call, you can put them in the chat, or you can contact me afterwards. So here's what we're going to do. If you book a call with me by the end of the day, I'll say, because it's in different time zones, I'm going to give you two great gifts. I'm going to give you the slides from this presentation, and I'm going to give you a 1-month subscription to my webinars. I do weekly webinars called Dynamic Dialogue, and these are valued at $145. These webinars are interesting, cover a variety of topics, are informative, timely because I do them every week, and I offer tips and ideas that you can integrate into your supplier and supply chain management. And I know it's great to get free stuff, because I love to get free stuff, but you have to book the call today. You can schedule a convenient time for you, but book it today. So http://callwithjane.com will get you there, and you can book that call. So please do that. And now it's time for prizes. So if you haven't already, send me an email with webinar as the subject. Send it to jane@purplelink, all one word, .co. If you do that, you're going to get some more information, and you'll get some stuff just for signing up. So you receive more information about our webinars, workshops, and if you'd like a follow-up call from me, you can write follow-up in the subject along with webinar. So I'm seeing somebody says my calendars aren't available, so I will make sure that that's updated within about an hour after I get off of this call. So I'll give you a minute to send me the emails if you haven't already done it with the webinar in that. And you're going to get, the winner is going to get 3 great prizes. You're going to get the slides from today's presentation. And actually, everybody who sends me right now an email with webinar on the subject will get the slides because I give them out to people who want them. So I will make that available. I'll send you the slides. You're going to get a good book. This book is called Measure What Matters. It's done really well. It's written by John Doerr. It's recommended by Bill Gates. I think it was on his summer reading list. And he talks about his experience as a venture capitalist working with the Google team. And he really stresses OKRs, objectives and key results. So it's a great book, and I'll send you that book. And you're going to get a 1-month subscription to Dynamic Dialogue weekly webinars. So if you win these prizes, you'll get that. And did I mention that webinars are $145 a month? That's what I charge. So that's a great value for that. And if you want that prize, then give me that. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to turn in your emails, and then I'm going to pick a winner. And you can always go to my website and see more trainings, workshops, and things that are available. So I'm doing my random number generator here to pick a winner. And if I count, let's see. The winner is going to be Danielle Amico. So I hope I did that correctly. Danielle, congratulations. Danielle, if you'll send me your address to where I can mail the book in a separate email, then I will follow up and do that. So thank you, all of you who have participated in that. And I'll get that sent out. One last thing I want to leave you with. My philosophy is we should all continue to strive to thrive. And I'm a big fan of Albert Einstein and worked for companies where there's a lot of intense pressure, so I know how it feels. But Einstein says we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So we have to do things differently. We've got a lot of talented people, a lot of excitement going on about what's possible now, even as a result of this horrible pandemic. So think about new things in new ways. And if you need some help to do that, Purple Link's available. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Jane. That was a great presentation. We hope everyone enjoyed today's program. Just an information note, if anybody's interested in getting the certification for the CPSM, Jane will be holding the first class for exam number 1 starting September 3rd, and it runs through December 10th. If you're interested, please see our website for details and how to register. Our next program will be on September 10th, where we will actually have 2 presentations. One is on assessing, leveraging, and inspecting for risk, and the top gotchas in a subscription agreement. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and we will be sending out a survey, your CEH, and the recording link as well as soon as it's posted to our YouTube site. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Have a great day and a week, everyone.